Hi, everyone. Welcome to SmartHER News. My name is Jenna, and I'm so glad you're here today for a wide-ranging conversation on one of the top news stories we've been covering over the last several weeks, and that's the war between Israel and Hamas. During that time period, one of the key questions that has emerged from many of you is as follows, and I'm summarizing a little bit here. How does the past impact the present? What do I need to know about history to truly understand the different dynamics at play? These are really big, important questions, and I believe we found a remarkable guest to discuss them with today. His name is Aaron David Miller. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's an institution, by the way, that's been around for more than 100 years to bring together some of the brightest minds in the world to solve our biggest challenges. And you'll see why Aaron blends right in that mission. He spent his professional life, the past 50 years or so, focused on the topic that we're going to discuss today. He worked at the U.S. State Department at one time under Republicans, under Democrats. He served under 6 different secretaries of state. And one of his main roles was as a negotiator for the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so you'll see how he brings this very unique experience with insight to the conversation so many of us are now having. In his years after serving our government, he's written 5 different books. He's spoken out on many of these issues regarding foreign policy in the United States, and he's very busy considering the current news cycle. So I'm very grateful and honored that he spent a little time with us to discuss what's going on, why it matters, what should we know from the past that we can apply to current conversation. So without further ado, here's Aaron David Miller. So, Aaron, I read that in 1977, you received your PhD in Middle East and U.S. diplomatic history. Tell us a little bit about that. Why did you choose that as your study of interest?
I was studying Civil War history at the University of Michigan in the late 60s, early 70s, and I ran into 2 professors. One was a professor of modern Middle Eastern history. The other one was an expert in Americans at war, and both of them had come to the university after they had been Foreign Service officers. The stories they told and the experiences they had were so remarkable that I concluded then and there that if I wanted to teach, which I did at the time, that didn't work out, that I really needed the sort of real world experiences that they had. I mean, particularly Richard Mitchell, who a Syrian American who basically was an expert on the Muslim Brotherhood, also had worked for the U.S. government, basically told stories of the Middle East. And I really needed to have, I thought, that kind of experience. So they agreed that if I could learn 2 new languages and pass my orals in 2 or 3 new fields, that I could get a degree in Middle Eastern history, U.S. diplomacy. So this was in the spring of 73, and Lindsay and I were not married yet. We got married in May, and we packed up a lot of books and moved to the only city in the world where you could study Arabic and Hebrew as living languages, which was Jerusalem. And 3 months after we arrived, the October War broke out. And October 6, 1973, I'll never forget it. To compare that experience with the crisis today is extraordinary. There was no CNN, no Fox, no MSNBC, no internet, no social media. We were in a complete and utter blackout. But what motivated me during the year plus we were there was that, forget history. I had believed that I'd now somehow experienced part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I wanted to be, without sounding pretentious or presumptuous, because I don't mean to sound that way, I wanted to be part of that history. So we came back, graduated from the University of Michigan with a PhD in Middle Eastern history and U.S. diplomacy, and started working for the Department of State. And that was in late 77. And until 2003, under Republican and Democratic administrations, I was fortunate to have a seat at the table for most of the confrontations that occurred during that period and most of the diplomatic achievements or lack thereof that the U.S. was involved in. So, you know, Jenna, you can be traveling down the highway and you get off at an exit ramp and you never get back on the highway again. Sometimes that's for ill, but in my case, it really was for good. I mean, and it's testament to the fact that you really can't see what's in front of you. And you have to, I think, be willing to be as flexible as you possibly can and to go with things that motivate you. I told my kids, probably the only piece of advice they ever took from me, the happiest people I know professionally, on the personal side, it's something else, but professionally, are the ones who can marry passion with expertise. They love what they do and they know what they're talking about, because passion without expertise can be dangerous, and expertise without passion can be incredibly boring. I was lucky, and I left government in '03. When I left, I remember Colin Powell gave me two pieces of advice. He was the last Secretary of State I worked for. He said, I'll give you two, try to keep both of these things in mind. He said, number one, don't try to come back. He said, you've been part of something quite unique. And the other piece of advice he gave me was don't try to look back. And I wholeheartedly accepted the first piece, but I rejected the second. And I've spent the last 20 years since I left government, 3 years before the Bush 43 administration invaded Iraq. I've been in the public conversation trying to look back in an effort to see what we got right and what we got wrong. And yeah, I have no regrets.
Fascinating. There's a lot of wisdom there, Aaron, to pick through whether it's diplomacy or life, as you point out. And probably there's a nice crossover between parental advice and foreign policy advice. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that too. What do you think? Because so many Americans are now approaching what we're seeing as the conflict in the Middle East with new eyes and a fresh situation for the first time. This is an area of the world that you know, that you've lived in, that you studied the language. What did you learn working on the inside of the State Department and the US government that you believe we should know more about on the outside as people new to this topic?
I guess I would identify three. I mean, forgive me, I don't want to lecture or provide advice, but I'll tell you three things that have helped me wrestle with the problems that, despite all the efforts that we put in, have basically, well, the current crisis suggests it. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still not resolved. So I give you three sort of insights. Number one, to understand America and foreign policy, I really think you have to understand the old real estate aphorism that success in real estate is all about location, location, and location. Where we're located, where the U.S. is geographically, is critically important to understanding why we behave the way we do abroad. We are the only great power in the history of the world that is literally sandwiched between two non-predatory powers to our north and south, Canada and Mexico, and literally fish to our east and west, what one historian brilliantly described, I wish it had been me, as our liquid assets. These two oceans and these non-predatory neighbors separate us from almost any power with which we deal, no matter how big they are, China or Russia, or how small, Israel, Egypt, Palestinians, Iran. I think it explains our idealism, because we've never had to contend since the mid-19th century with any sort of invading or occupying force. It explains our naivete. I think we don't understand the mentality of the small power. It explains our pragmatism. We come to believe that if enlightened men and women would only sit down and rationalize things out, that all problems in the world could have solutions. And I think it also explains our arrogance, because we have a margin for making mistakes that most powers in the world don't, because of our physical isolation and separation from the world. So that notion of, and I think, by the way, I would not trade where we are for anything. I think where we are has created an opportunity and given us the time and space to create an extraordinary country with all of its imperfections, an amazing, amazing country. But we need to understand that where we are does influence how we look at the world and how we behave in it, and it's not always for the good. The second issue, I think, pertains to the Middle East. There's a wonderful piece of philosophy. I don't know who came up with it. And it goes like this. In the history of the world, in the entire history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. And why don't people wash rental cars? They don't wash rental cars because it's human nature to care only about what you own. Now, invariably, when I speak, I'll use this line, and 2 or 3 weeks later, I'll get a letter with a receipt in the mail. Usually, again, I'm just reporting here, so don't shoot me. Usually from a wife, a sister, or a mother. And it's a receipt for a car wash, but it's not really typical behavior for people to wash rental cars. I make this point with respect to the Middle East because the reality is, unless you have real ownership, unless you really care about solving the problem, no matter how brilliant the negotiator. I worked for James Baker in the first Bush administration. Guy was the best negotiator since Henry Kissinger. It was wonderful to see him operate. But even with James Baker, you need local ownership. The Arabs and the Israelis really have to care and protect the fact that they want to solve this problem, because if they don't, you and I will be having this conversation every year, and there won't be much to show for it. That's the second proposition. The third, and I really think this is a life lesson, it's not just for diplomacy. There was a Protestant theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, Catholic, who wrote, and he did a lot of work in American foreign policy, but he also understood human frailty and weakness. And Niebuhr believed that the best you could do is come up with proximate solutions to insoluble problems. I really think, whether it's business, marriage, friendship, diplomacy, finding a balance between the way the world really is, or the way the world is, and the way you want it to be, that's really, seems to me, usually where problems get solved. We declare war on things: the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on mental illness, the war on poverty. The war on cancer, we will win. But these other wars, the war on racial injustice in America, these are complex problems which depend on humans to sort of cooperate to create systemic solutions. We're not winning the war on poverty or mental illness or gun control. The war on terror, it'll go on. I don't think it's a major threat externally to the United States. The war on cancer, because it is a scientific, technological problem, we will win it. We really will. These others, I don't think so. And what it suggests to me is that in America, change more often than not is evolutionary. It occurs incrementally. And if you look at the Arab-Israeli issue, if you looked at the confrontation line in 1948 and you look at the confrontation line in 2023, despite this parade of horrors that we witnessed, look what you do have. You have an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty that's endured since 1979. You have an Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, which has endured since 1994. You have the beginnings of real relationships between Israel and the Gulf states. The UAE, Bahrain. Israel has a very good relationship with Morocco. If the Israeli-Palestinian problem could be resolved, and the parade of horrors that was inflicted upon the Israelis by Hamas on October 7, and the Israeli response in an effort to strike Hamas targets in Gaza, which has caused thousands of Palestinian deaths and displacement from their homes. If somehow, when the dust settles, some opportunity could be fashioned out of all of this misery, and you could really make progress on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I think you really could think about not disproving or proving Niebuhr wrong, but basically coming up with a pretty stable region. But it's a very tall order. And in the Middle East, there are only two speeds when it comes to negotiation: slow and slower.
You mentioned 1948, and I'd love to rely on some of your historic knowledge. When we were talking before the interview started, I explained that one of the challenges I've had as a journalist during this time period is answering the essential question that I'm getting most from my audience, which is, wait a minute, take me back. I understand the last couple weeks. I have a good foundational understanding of the last several weeks of this conflict. But how was Israel created as a state? How did this all start?
You
That's a really big question, Aaron. I'm gonna
you-
toss it to you to
right.
try to figure out where you'd like to begin there.
You and I could spend the next 3 weeks talking about this. And by the way, there are different narratives. I mean, just reporting, the state of Israel came into being existence, declared in May of 1948. The Americans recognized it in a de facto manner 11 minutes after it was created. The first state, interestingly enough, to actually recognize Israel was the former Soviet Union, because the Soviets saw the migration of Eastern European Jews, the early Zionists, combined with the fact that the state of Israel was and a putative state, an Arab state, which was offered by the UN Security Council in 1947 to the Arabs, was part of a decolonization process. Remember, the British in the early 20s held the mandates from the UN. Well, it was then League of Nations for the for Jordan and for what was then Palestine. The French held the mandates for Syria and Lebanon. And under British control, the early Zionists, mainly from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, began to cooperate with the mandatory authorities. And during those early years, the 20s and the 30s, um, what was then called the Jewish Yishuv, which is Hebrew for settlement or community, began to formulate all of the institutions that would later come to comprise the state of Israel. What triggered and what I think acted as a fundamental catalyst was World War II and the Nazi genocide of world Jewry, of European Jewry. It was that cataclysm, the Nazi Holocaust, that created both the political sympathy, certainly in the United States, and the desire of Jews living in what was then Palestine under British control to think about getting Jewish refugees from Europe and creating a pathway for immigration to create a state. So in 1947, the UN Security Council offered a partition plan, literally to partition what is now historic Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The word Palestinian was not used then. It would come to identify those Arab inhabitants, many of whom were forcibly expelled in a concerted Israeli effort. I guess some would describe it today as ethnic cleansing. Many were caught up in the confusion and the chaos of war, because once the Israelis declared their state, they were attacked by 4 or 5 Arab armies. And it was during the period 1947 and 1949, 1949 there was finally an armistice agreement between Israel and Jordan and its neighbors. The Israeli Zionists turned this community with these institutions into an incipient state. The Arabs rejected the partition plan. They found it unfair. The Palestinians were completely dependent and divided. And the Arabs, frankly, had no interest and desire to see a separate state of Palestine created. There wasn't enough organizational.
Why?
I think it's largely because, first of all, they were defeated by the Israelis in that war, and the establishment of the State of Israel became a sort of, I don't know, object of humiliation, a mirror in many respects that reflected Arab weakness. They also were very mistrustful of and concerned about Palestinian refugees, many of whom, as we know, ended up in Lebanon and in Syria. Not many in Egypt, but Lebanon and in Syria and in Jordan. And they became, as refugee populations would, a under-resourced, underprivileged, disenfranchised sort of presence in these Arab countries. And Arab regimes, sensitive to the fact that they had been humiliated by the Israelis, became vulnerable to attacks, physical attacks and verbal attacks, by what would become, by the early 60s, the Palestine Liberation Organization, who sought to turn a disenfranchised refugee population into a resistance movement of national liberation, pursuing terrorist activities, both in terms of attacking Israelis. Those were the late 60s and early 70s, were the era of the hijacking of airplanes. You had the 1972 Munich massacre by Black September, which was an offshoot of the largest PLO group, Fatah, the one that Arafat controlled, who, by the way, united the PLO under his control by 1968. So you had all kinds of cross currents. You had Arab states worried about their own domestic stability, humiliated by the Israelis. You had Palestinian refugees for the first time acting not just against Israelis, but against the regimes. Some of the most violent confrontations that occurred in the Middle East between the mid-60s and the early 80s occurred between the Palestinian National Movement in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and those respective regimes. So this was it became a confused muddle, punctuated by a war. 1948, the creation of the State of Israel triggered the War for Independence. 1956, in that decade, the Israelis, in combination with the British and French, in an effort to get rid of Gamal Abdel Nasser and to reassert British control of the canal, launched a war in Sinai. 1967, the Egyptians and Syrians were pressing the Israelis, and the Israelis preempted, and you had the Six-Day War. And 6 years later, in 1973, I happened to be, and as I mentioned, Lindsay and I were in Jerusalem on that day, October 6th, hard to imagine, 50 years ago, last month, when Egypt and Syria, despite Israel's intelligence conception that the Arabs would not strike, struck. And it was a traumatic experience, much like the one that Israelis are feeling today, a major intelligence failure. But unlike any of the previous conflicts, that 73 war would lead to 3 disengagement agreements, 2 between Israel and Egypt, 1 between Israel and Syria, and would see, under American auspices, an Egyptian-Israeli peace process that would end 6 years later in the signing on a White House lawn of between Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, Menachem Begin, prime minister, and Jimmy Carter, President Carter, an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. So that was an example of trauma turning to hope. I told this story because in October 6, 73, we watched Israelis traumatized, but within 6 years, that trauma turned to hope. 20 years later, in September 13th, 1993, as part of an American delegation, I was sitting on the White House lawn watching Arafat, Rabin, and President Clinton sign the Oslo Accords, thinking, wrongly, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would end. It's only a matter of time. And yet, in that case, hope turned to trauma. So it's a cautionary tale that the arc of history bends in unpredictable ways. We can't see what's in front of us. And our responsibility, I think, is to try, to the extent we can, to bend that arc of history in the right direction. Right now, it's bending in the wrong direction, to say the least.
How did the United States become a key ally of Israel? And what do you believe is our role in both the current process that's in front of us right now, which is the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and looking into the future of trying to be a force for good in the world and bringing peace?
Right. Truman's decision in April, May of 1948 to recognize the State of Israel was driven by some of the factors that would continue to be the drivers of what would become a remarkably resilient relationship between the United States and Israel. Number one was the moral debt that Truman believed the United States owed to the Jewish people in the wake of the Nazi genocide. A second was domestic politics. And Harry Truman talked about this openly. It would drive his advisors at the Department of State, who argued against recognition of Israel. But that domestic political influence, the presence of a large and affluent Jewish community that argues strongly the case for Israel, supported, frankly, by a non-Jewish majority in the United States that have come to see Israel more in line with American values than any other nation in the region. And a driving force behind this effort became evangelical Christians, who, for reasons of eschatology, what would happen at the end of days, the end of times, in which Jews and Israel do play a major role, and value affinity. The sense that for many evangelical Christians, Israel represented and was much more in line with democracy, pluralism, free press than any Arab regime. And Israel is the only democracy, however imperfect, in that region. For one of my books, I interviewed all of the former evangelical leaders. And I remember one conversation with Jerry Falwell in the back of his SUV down at Liberty University. And he was trying to explain to me, I said, is it eschatology? Is it the role that Jews in Israel are supposed to play and in the end of times? Is that what motivates you? And he looked at me, he said, Aaron, he said, I don't know when the end of time's coming, but all I know is this. Israel represents a sea of stability and democracy, or an outpost of democracy and humanism, and a sea of intolerance and tyranny. That was Jerry Falwell's view. And I think the value affinity of the here and now was much more important to someone like Falwell than the sort of end of days, end of times conception of what happens. So you had domestic politics, you had the moral issue. And remember, Israel was created in the wake of what would be a Cold War with the former Soviet Union. And the United States began to look at Israel, common identity, as a sort of not strategic partner yet, but a pro-Western regime in the middle of a Middle East that had a lot of Egypt, Syria, pro-Russian leaning Arab states. The real key to the relationship, though, I think occurred in the 70s in the wake of the October War, where the United States, excuse me, the Nixon administration ended up providing a massive airlift during the Yom Kippur, the October War. And it was in the early 70s, not only did the peace process begin with the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and a tremendous commitment in dollars, both to Israel and Egypt in the wake of the Camp David agreements, but a very close institutionalized relationship with the state of Israel developed during the Reagan administration. It really was two Republican presidents under Nixon and Reagan that saw the closeness of this relationship emerge. We did our research and development with Israel. We pre-positioned material in Israel for our own purposes. We joint exercise with the Israelis. And that institutional relationship has survived and become a bedrock despite various tensions between American presidents, and I've seen them over the years, and Israeli prime ministers. The institutional nature of the relationship. I would argue, however, that why do we support Israel today? There is no more Soviet Union. Well, you have Russia, and you do have a global competition for power, in which the Israelis are frankly more on our side than the Russians and the Chinese, let alone the Iranians. But the relationship now, because of the perception that both on values and interests, there are now more differences of opinion between the US and Israel. The Netanyahu government, the current government, created last December, now almost a year old, remember, tried to rearrange the democratic process in Israel and to aggrandize power. And second, began to pursue policies on the West Bank, which were essentially annexationist in everything but name. So the relationship became more fraught. And that also mirrored, and this will come as no surprise to you, the partisan nature of what's happening in our own politics. The Republican Party essentially And just so your listeners and viewers understand, I've worked for Democrats and Republicans, and I voted for Democrats and Republicans. The Republican Party, today's Republican Party, which is more or less distant from the Republicans with whom I worked and the ones I voted for, has become the Israel right or wrong party. The Democratic Party is now more divided among progressives who are willing to be much more vocal and critical of Israel, and a traditional mainstream Democratic Party, which is still quite supportive. So you have domestic politics, you have the moral issue, you have the strategic part. Israel is a strategic partner. But in the end, in my judgment, you could take all the other ones away. There'll come a point, there'll be no Holocaust survivors will pass from the scene. The Holocaust hopefully will continue to be sorts of inspiration to all humans everywhere, to never forget and to be very aware of genocide, no matter on whom it's foisted. But the one ingredient, to me, that is the core to maintaining the relationship. It's not Israel's strategic partner, not the domestic politics. If you took the value affinity away, the perception that most Americans have that rightly or wrongly, however different these two societies and their political structures are, that there are common values, if you take that away, or if that erodes, then I think at that point, the U.S.-Israeli relationship will also begin to change. I don't think that we've reached that point yet, but it's conceivable, particularly as younger generations, I look at my own kids, become more critical for any number of reasons, or less interested in foreign policy and in the world. Attitudes can change.
That's just something we've seen throughout history, and also can see just in the way that this current story has evolved. I know we're getting short on time, and you have a bunch of interviews considering your vast knowledge, Aaron. So I want to be really sensitive to that. I have two final questions for you. One is, when did you first hear the term Hamas, and in what context was that? Why does that matter?
Hamas was created in the early 80s. It was essentially the Palestinian derivative of the Muslim Brotherhood, which actually was created in Egypt in 1928. So you have a Palestinian national movement. Christians are in a minority, mostly Muslim, but the vast majority, I would say 2/3 of the Palestinian national movement and 2/3 of Palestinians, even though they are Muslim, of the Islamic faith, they are secular when it comes to the aspirations and process of what they want for their future. Best embodied, of course, by the two-state solution. Hamas is the manifestation, the organizational manifestation of an Islamist trend within the Palestinian national movement, which in Hamas's case, even though I'm sure there are divisions within the Hamas movement, is pretty radical. They've toyed with the idea over the years of recognizing a two-state solution, but never willing to, number one, recognize Israel as the PLO has done. Number two, never willing to lay down the gun and not participate in the armed struggle. And I think over the years, created in 1987, with deep roots into the fabric of Gaza. Remember, we're talking about a tiny area, maybe twice the size of the District of Columbia, 2.3 million people, half of whom are under the age of 15, 21,000 humans per square mile. It's underserviced, under-resourced, employment of 55%. In 2007, Hamas, which existed outside of the formal PLO structure, ended up actually mounting a coup against the PLO and Fatah presence in Gaza and became its own little entity. And from 2007 until now, it has had an extremely confrontational relationship with Israel. It has never given up the gun and never been willing to participate in any sort of diplomatic process. And as a consequence, Israel and Hamas have had at least 4 major confrontations: 2008/09, 2011, 2014, 2021. This one, however, on October 7, went beyond anything that we've seen. And while Hamas is not the Islamic State, it's a much more sophisticated organization with much deeper roots among the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, in the West Bank. The tactics that Hamas adopted within the first 24 hours, the indiscriminate, intentional, willful murder, torture, the hostage taking, took matters in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict beyond anything that we've seen. The suicide bombings that Hamas and even parts of Fatah undertook in Israel proper during the Second Intifada were terrible. This went even beyond that. And the hostage situation, the fact that they've grabbed as many as 230 hostages, mostly Israelis, a fair number of foreign nationals, some dual nationals, has created a challenge that, as the Israeli ambassador to the United States said, on October 6th, Israel was one kind of country. On October 8th, it was another. And the challenge for the Israelis right now is an incredibly cruel one on 2 levels. Number one, how do you eradicate Hamas as a military organization? Forget eradicating it as an idea, but as a military organization, when you're dealing with densely populated areas, high population to square mile ratios, where Hamas is willfully and has co-located its own assets proximate to civilian facilities. How do you operate in such an area without causing immense suffering and death to Palestinians who, frankly, aren't interested in taking up the gun? That's the first dilemma. And frankly, I have not heard an answer. All the interviews I've done with all the humans, Americans, Israelis, I have not heard an alternative for how you reduce humanitarian suffering and still carry out, as if you're an Israeli government, the debt you owe to the 1,400 Israelis who are dead. So that's the first cruel dilemma. The second is the hostages. Israel has a commitment to never allowing anything like this to happen again. It has a commitment to the 1,400 Israelis who were killed. But it also, given its own priorities and history, has a commitment to the living. The large number of Israelis, men, women, and children, babies, who are held hostage by Hamas. And the government of Israel over the years has engaged in asymmetrical trades. In 2011, they traded one Israeli corporal who had been taken by Hamas in 2005. It took 6 years to do this deal, for 1,079 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. One for 1,079. So how do they reconcile? And the hostage families, the families of the hostages, understandably are bringing enormous pressure to bear on the government to make the redemption of these hostages a priority. But how do you operate against Hamas, who are holding these people, when you literally are out to eliminate the 200 top leaders that planned and were responsible for this massacre on October 7th? How do you do that without risking the lives of over 200 people? And again, I've heard no good answers to that question. This is what makes this so cruel. And the loss of life on the Palestinian side. I mean, the massacres of October 7th were unspeakable, unprecedented. But those cannot allow us to push out of our hearts and minds the suffering of Palestinians on whom Hamas has visited this terrible tragedy. And I don't know how to reconcile that either.
Well, the question of how to help is a big one. And we know there's a lot going on behind the scenes. You're more familiar with that than anybody else. And because you worked for both Republicans and Democrats and have seen the world from different points of view, What advice would you give those working behind the scenes now, based on your experience, to try to get to a better result than where we are at this point?
Well, right now we're in the middle of a crisis. You've got a humanitarian crisis. You have a hostage crisis. You have an Israeli ground campaign crisis against Hamas. I don't think, given the Biden administration's support for Israel, understandable, the president's personal and emotional support for the idea of Israel, I think that the United States really is operating within a very narrow frame. And again, I wish I had an answer. I wish I could tell you that there were fixes to the humanitarian situation, negotiations of the hostages, and how to eradicate and remove Hamas from Gaza without causing massive death and destruction of innocents. I have to be honest. I don't have answers to that. Uh, there will be a day after. And the real question is, we're in a long, dark tunnel. There will be a day after. The real question is, will Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans, the three principal parties, I think, to try to mold something better out of this parade of horrors that we witness, will the three parties be able to fashion something that is better than what we've seen, better than the status quo on October 6th? And my sense is that you're going to be left with two societies, Israelis and Palestinians, that are traumatized. And you also have the reality that the Biden administration is dealing with a Russian invasion of Ukraine, an Iran that is on the cusp of, if they wanted to, develop nuclear weapons, a China that is involved in a global competition with the United States, and, dare I say, an election, which will be extremely important to determining where we as a country go. All this stuff, and governing is about choosing. Franklin Roosevelt said that Abraham Lincoln, our undeniably greatest president, died a sad man because Lincoln could not have everything. And I wonder, in FDR's mind, another great president, governing is about choosing. You can't have everything. That's a life's lesson, frankly. You have to set priorities. And frankly, I don't know what sort of choice the administration is going to make in an election year, juggling all of these foreign policy priorities with a sort of dysfunctional domestic political environment. I would end on a positive note, however. Jack Kennedy was the first and last president who ever really had an emotional impact on me. I was 12 when he was assassinated. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. And I love that. I've stolen it from Jack Kennedy. I think that's where America should be. I think that's where I am. Never give up. Never give up. We only occupy a tiny space on the planet for a very short period of time. We can't see what's in front of us. People who say this will never be, you can't do this, it's morally or ethically unconscionable to our children. So never give up thinking that you can make yourself better, your community, the country. But as you go through this process, you have to go through it with your eyes wide open. You have to try to strike the balance between the world the way it is and the way you want it to be. Because if you only function according to the world the way it is, nothing changes. On the other hand, if you tether yourself to a philosophy that says this is what I want and this is the way it has to be, more likely than not, you're going to fail. It's the balance between the two that works, I think, more often than not, in diplomacy, in marriage, in friendship, and in life in general.
Well, thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. As a journalist, it's easy to try to cover the worst case scenarios. And we talk about this in Smarter News that you can really spend a lot of time in the dark, but you also have to consider the lights. You have to consider the best case scenarios too. And so we're going to continue to strive for that throughout the reporting process. We have a million more questions for you, but I know you have to run. So I look forward to having you back, Aaron. Thank you so much
You're
for the
great.
time today.
Jenna, you're a great interview, and Smarter's it's a clever, not only a clever concept, it's wise. And I wish you the best and all
I,
of
kn-
your listeners and viewers.
I knew you were smart, Aaron. Thank you so much.
Take care. And we'll definitely
Aaron,
do it again. Thanks, Jenna.
I'd love it.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.